Good morning, everybody. My name is Dan Kraft from Forum Global, and the event partners for this event, Ericsson, GSMA, Huawei, Nokia, and ZTE, have asked me to just say a few words at the start, just to welcome everybody, and also to talk a little bit about the platform and to let you know about the different features on the platform. So we're going to be starting with the webinar very shortly. But just to talk you through a few of the different aspects of the platform first. You are now on the main stage in the platform. So the main stage is where all of the sessions today are going to be taking place. So if you're here, then you have found the correct area for all the sessions to be taking place. If you look to the right-hand side of your screen, you have a chat area. And we want to hear from you. The partners want to hear from you, want to hear your comments, want to hear your questions. So please do put any questions or comments that you have during the event. Please put those in the chat, and those will be passed over to our speakers and to our moderator. So please do use that chat and make sure that your voice is heard as part of this event as well. You're also able to see who's attending the event and to send individual messages and to network with people using the People tab on the right-hand side of your screen. So if you wanted to do that, send messages on a one-to-one basis to people, or even set up individual video chats, then you can do that using the People's tab on the right-hand side of your screen. So very simple, but please do get involved. Please do add your comments and questions, as I said, and we want this event to be interactive, so please do that. So that said, I would like to now pass over to Jawad Abbasi from GSMA, who is going to be saying a few words to officially start the event. So Jawad, great to see you there, and I will pass the floor over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's quite early for some, very convenient for those in the Gulf. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بالجميع. طبعا اليوم التركيز على العالم العربي، فبدي أحكي شوية كلمات باللغة العربية ترحيبية. بشكركم لحضوركم معنا، وطيب زي ما بتعرفوا رابط GSMA بتمثل مصالح قطاع الاتصالات وشركات الخلوي، وإحنا بالخدمة دوما، وإن شاء الله دائما نقدر نتقدم بقطاع الاتصالات الخلوية في العالم العربي. The Arab world, especially the Gulf region, has been a very nice and very reputable global leader on 5G, with the earliest launches in the world and some good growth. Plum Consulting, for example, recently described the region as 5G pioneers. Now, the pioneering role of the Gulf and the Arab region at large was really, spectrum has been at the heart of this leadership. 5G growth in the Middle East and North Africa has depended on the development of core bands such as the 700 and 800 megahertz as well as the 3.5 gigahertz. This work has been primarily driven forward by harmonization and the excellent work done by the Arab Spectrum Management Group. The Arab world already has 5 million plus 5G users. I am one of them in the United Arab Emirates. Excellent service, and it is growing quite rapidly. Our GSMA intelligence, the research arm of the GSMA, expects the numbers to double next year and the year after. Arab countries are also continuing to show leadership on spectrum issues, both within the Arab Spectrum Management Group and the ITU. For example, the ASMG has made decisions to lead the world in developing 1500 megahertz for 5G, while Arab countries are also at the center of activity on further mobile use of the UHF bands at the ITU as part of the WRC process. The mid-band spectrum that we are discussing today will be used for the next phase of 5G growth in the time frame of 2025 to 2030, and the Arab countries have the chance to continue as pioneers and global leaders on laying the foundations for 5G development. So with that, I conclude my opening remarks, and again, thank you everybody for joining us. وأهلا وسهلا فيكم ومرحبا.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for that, Jawad. My name is Stefan Seele from Koliago Consulting. I have the pleasure of introducing this very important event, very timely event. Whilst, of course, 5G is already a reality and the Gulf states have emerged as some of the world leaders in 5G, the needs for the region, for the Arab region, are very diverse, but they have one thing in common, and that is the need for spectrum, sometimes driven by additional requirements, such as the lack of fixed network connectivity, where we'll get 5G FWA will play a major role, particularly in Africa, and also some of the largest and highest density cities in the world, if I think of Egypt. So with that, we have a very good panel looking at the various aspects of spectrum management in the context of making 5G reality, because 5G means not only a technology development, but also developments in terms of spectrum, low, mid-band, which is the key capacity band for citywide speed coverage, as well as high bands or millimeter wave. So with that, I'd like to now introduce our first speaker, Tariq El-Awadi, the Executive Director of Spectrum Affairs of the Telecommunications Regulatory Agency of the UAE. So over to you, Tariq.
Good morning. You can hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't see you yet.
Right now?
Now we can see you. Wonderful. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Dan, for everything. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Good morning, everyone. And I'm sorry that because I'm out of the office, I was having a meeting, so I'm doing from other place. So sorry for that. On behalf of ASMG Group and all Arab countries, also we'd like to thank Forum Europe for organizing this event, and thank also to GSMA and others for bringing this important issue, the future of mid-band spectrum, IMT spectrum needs, policy development, and the role of 6 gigahertz. I'll just have I'll share with you the latest update of ASMG Group with regard to 6 gigahertz. I can see right now 6 gigahertz is one of the important band becoming for all countries in order to see how we can use this band for having heavy traffic and to have a mid-band between the millimeter wave and the lower band. So I'm just sharing with you right now a very short presentation. You have it right now, slide 2. As you're all aware, there is an agenda item 1.2, identification of IMT in the frequency band in 3 gigahertz, 6 gigahertz, up to 7.125 megahertz, and then 10 gigahertz. So the request here that to review the regulatory requirement within the footnote 5.42 429B, and then identify the frequency band 33 to 34 for IMT system for countries wishing to do using the IMT, and also follow up the studies, identify the frequency and the frequency range for IMT, and of course with emphasizing to protecting the existing services. In the last ASMG meeting, we had some of Arab countries want to emphasize on not to imposing restriction on IMT application. So if the identification will be there, we don't need to have that much restriction on IMT. I'll go on slide number 3. So what we need here and on 6 gigahertz, and we had developed as a questionnaire band. Of course, maybe you know that we already have one team in ASMG looking for technical, and one, of course, there is a teams for looking to all agenda items, and working group 1 looking for agenda item related to IMT. So this questionnaire here is, for example, when we did about the direction for IMT identification in the whole or part of the bands. So we get an answer about this question. Some administration do not support the limitation of 6 of this band, 6.4 to 6.7 to 7.1. and for IMT. Other administration are considering the studies held within the work of Working Party 5D and the compatibility of these application with other radio services in the band with a view to defining the direction or on the definition of the band for IMT system at the later time. The next question we had the current uses within with the priority. So existing use in this band, such as fixed services, fixed satellite services, and other in the same country. We have a priority. We need to see it. How we'll use it for mobile, or we use it for fixed services, or we use it for FSS. This is another question we have it. Another one, possible regulatory measures or conditions. We have to put a setting condition to provide protection for existing services and systems and not to affect them without imposing, of course, we have to make sure, without imposing undue restriction on possible identification for IoT system. Other views, considering the potential use of network access such as Wi-Fi in this band, and considering license exempt approach for assigning this frequency band. So these questions in the slide 3, we can see it. At least we have to know, we know that there are 3 countries in the Arab region who develop a public consultation on the 6 gigahertz band. That is Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, and UAE. And if I can tell you about the UAE, that the future look for wireless services and spectrum utilization, and we need to know the views also from the public, of course, I mean from the user, for other frequency band, for UHF, for the use of 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz. And this will help those countries to build their long-term plan on the usage of the mid bands. In slide number 5, here it shows the discussion which was going on in the working group of ASMG. So you can see it here in this map, which is how the frequency band of 6 gigahertz has been allocated or assigned by the countries. You know that there are some countries looking forward to assign part of it or all of it for Wi-Fi. In the Arab countries, there are also different views. You can see that in UAE, we have allocated only 500 megahertz for Wi-Fi. And the remaining, we said that we will see the studies and response from the for the public consultation. In Saudi Arabia, I believe you're all aware that they already assigned the whole band for Wi-Fi for license exempt. Other countries like Morocco also, they have assigned 500 megahertz. But the studies are going on in agenda item 1.2, and we are following up that studies. We are participating. UAE will and other countries would like to see how we can move forward in the future. In the slide number 6, we just here made an idea how we can see it in the future. Standard approach or innovative approach. If we can see a standard approach that we have 2 sub-bands, each band separate. I mean, one for mobile, one more for Wi-Fi, and we have to put portion of it. It will be see it at the WRC23. Again, another one, allow new entrance services with condition of protecting existing services. And this is, as we said, as standard approach. So that we have 2 sub-bands, one for Wi-Fi, one for other, and one also for the other will be maybe allowing for new entrants. For the innovative approach, both can coexist. With the license exempt or unlicensed approach, we can. This is depends on each country and their regulation, and of course, in order to solving the interference, such as using some new technologies and avoiding this kind of interference between the services by using maybe dynamic assignment access or dynamic sharing spectrum. This is my just brief about the 6 gigahertz studies that going on in ASMG in Arab countries, and we're still working on it. The working group for working group for agenda item 1.2, it's taking consideration of all responses and correspondence contribution studies, and we look forward to see from the mobile industry any such studies going on and help to reach a conclusion on how to use the 6 gigahertz with very sufficient and effective way in the future. With that, I really appreciate for your listening to me, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Tarek, very much. As always, very informative and concise, particularly with regards to the 6 gigahertz band. We'll now go on to a panel session. And of course, Tarek, after the other panel members gave their short speeches, we'll invite you back onto the panel so we can discuss these issues further. So next up is our first session for this event, which is about the future of IMT mid-band spectrum needs and the policy development. We have an excellent lineup of speakers here. To begin with, we have Luciana Camargos, who is now the acting head of spectrum for the GSMA. So presenting, if you will, the operator side. Then we have Peter Kozimi, the strategy manager from the Vodafone Group, to bring operator insights to this, particularly on the needs side. And we have from the regulator side, we have Abdul Hadi Abu Amal, Director Technology Standardization and Spectrum Management from Etisalat Group. And Tarek will join this panel as well. So over to you, Luciana, with your first remarks. I believe you have a set of slides.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Yes, I do. And it's a pleasure being here. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm in bleaky London today, so I apologize for the light behind me. Very jealous of those who are in the Middle East right now. So we're here today as the GSMA talking about the mid-band solutions for ASMG. It is a very important topic to us. We have released a number of reports. We have been doing a number of studies on this exact topic because we have an agenda item, but also because we see that 5G has changed the dynamic a bit of what we are going to do and how the operators are going to deliver things. And it's very important that we make sure that mid-band spectrum is addressed, is thought about from countries all around the world. So next slide, please. The first thing I would like to raise is the relationship between coverage and cost. We have done a study, and it's on the GSMA website, that 92% of the world's population is covered by mobile broadband. But 3.2 billion people live within mobile coverage, but they don't use it. And one of the main reasons why they don't use it is because they can't afford it. It's very important to make sure that the networks not only exist, the networks not only provide service, but that they are affordable to the population of the countries. And that comes to all sorts of things, but availability of spectrum is one of the main things. Is the spectrum policies is a key issue to make sure that this comes at affordable cost, so the population can afford it and will benefit from mobile broadband, or as we like to call now, and in the future it will be 5G. So next slide, please. We asked Coleago to do a study for us on the IMT 2020 requirements that drive the need for spectrum. Of course, we've seen that wheel from the ITU a number of times, and what was IMT Advanced and what is IMT 2020, what the requirements for IMT 2020 are, how IMT 2020 can deliver things, and for us, IMT 2020 and 5G work very closely. For mid-band spectrum, we consider that the two of those elements that are most relevant of course, we all need low band spectrum, mid band spectrum, and high band spectrum. For mid band spectrum, the area traffic capacity of 10 megabits per second per square meter, but also the user experience data rates that increased 10 times since 4G, since IMT advanced. And what we're talking about 5G is 100 megabits per second downlink and 50 megabits per second uplink. So it's great that the ITU does these specifications, these requirements for what 5G or IMT 2020 is going to do. But if you don't have enough spectrum to actually deliver that, it doesn't really mean anything at the end of the day. We need to make sure that the spectrum goes hand in hand with what was envisaged that IMT 2020 would deliver. So next slide, please. We published this study in July 21, and it talks about a number of study, I think 37 cities, if I'm not mistaken, and it talks about the spectrum needs in those 37 cities as cities that have high population densities. There are 4 cities that are in the region, in the ASMG region, that are on the screen right now. And we see that, you see that the demand sort of goes from low on the left hand of this slide to much higher on the right hand of this slide. And it's dependent on a few things. It's dependent on activity factor. It's dependent on the high bands offload. But we estimate, we understand that the way the spectrum needs work is that it starts from the left hand and it grows over time to the right hand as more people take over 5G in your countries, as more people take over, the activity factor grows, it means that the spectrum needs will be going on the high end. But we did an average of how much spectrum would be needed worldwide. And interestingly, for lower income countries, medium income countries, and high income countries, the average came pretty similar, that they need additional 2 gigahertz of spectrum on mid-band spectrum. What's mid-band spectrum? We understand mid-band spectrum between 1 and 7 gigahertz. So how are we going to make sure that this spectrum is available? So that's the most important question for the GSMA, is where is your mid-band spectrum going to come from? It can come from a number of bands. We have so many bands we have been discussing over the years. But at the end of the day, there are many bands available for us to study between 1 and 7 gigahertz. So if you go to the next slide, please. This is the existing IMT spectrum availability within Region 1. And you can see that for MENA, in between 1 and 3 gigahertz, there is 650 megahertz that is available, potentially available to be used if you use all the IMT spectrum identifications, which most countries already have. And then between 3 and 6 gigahertz, we have been positive there. So even though ASMG countries don't really have identifications of 500 megahertz above 3 gigahertz, the identification is only of 200 megahertz at this stage. We are considering that ASMG has taken a decision of 500 megahertz and will be using 500 megahertz of spectrum, so between 3.3 and 3.8. Even with that, that's 1150. For a 2 gigahertz of average spectrum needs for mid-band spectrum, where are your other, 850 megahertz of spectrum going to come from? And there are not many options. So if you go to the next slide, please. The bands that the WRC are talking about are 3.3, 3.4, 3.6, 3.8. We have already considered that is what is available within the region. It has been decided by ASMG. Then we have 4.8, 4.99, which is a band that is a candidate for many regions, but very difficult for other regions of the world. And then we have 6.425 to 7.125. 10 to 10.5 is not really relevant for region 1, but it's also based on the characteristics of the ITU, quite hotspot type, more like millimeter wave band than of mid-band spectrum. So the only band that we can see as available or as potential for ASMG to fulfill their spectrum needs in mid-band is the 6 gigahertz band. And we believe that it's very important that decisions are made to allow for that, because if you don't allow enough mid-band spectrum, what will happen is that there won't be enough of the IMT 2020 characteristics and requirements set out by the ITU available for those who would like to use them. So with that, I will conclude my presentation, and I'll be looking forward to the panel later on. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you very much for those insights, and particularly pointing out that 5G is really a little bit of a revolution when it comes to the performance requirement that are a factor 10 or even 100 more than 4G, and spectrum must be made available to deliver this. I just wanted to point out that we'll take questions at the end of the panel. So for the audience, if you put in your questions in the chat functions, and we then try to pass this on to the speakers at the end of this session. But next up, we've got Peter Cosimini from Vodafone.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Stefan, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to present today on a topic that's not just interesting or important to operators, but our consumers and society in general. And it was a very interesting and important context from Luciana that I hope to add some further colour around. So just a little bit about Vodafone and what we do, because I think it's important to set the context. Next slide, please. So first thing to highlight is that we deliver connectivity. We operate both fixed broadband and mobile broadband networks in 21 countries, both within Europe and outside Europe. So our core business is connectivity. And we have the largest next generation fixed broadband footprint in Europe. So fixed, very, very important business for us. And we connect consumers and enterprises. And we connect a variety of different devices, from not just smartphones, but cars, Internet of Things devices, sensors, and even provide wireless broadband services through our FWA services, fixed wireless access services. So, and this is important to highlight because in the context of spectrum needs, we need as a converged player, we need to consider very carefully both licensed spectrum needs for mobile services and licensed spectrum needs, and as an operator of connectivity, we think we're in quite a unique position to understand and explain what the customer needs, and that's the most important thing. It's what the customer and society needs. Next slide, please, Jordan. So just a little bit about how mobile and fixed services are evolving. So both mobile and fixed network traffic is continuing to accelerate. It approximately doubles every 2 years, and we see that acceleration expecting to continue. And that's driven by a number of different service requirements. And there you can see some on the right-hand side, but everyone's aware of the move to cloud-based services, cloud gaming, streaming is very, very popular, if not the most popular service in both our fixed and mobile broadband networks today, and that will evolve with higher definition streaming. Again, further increasing demand. Our Internet of Things, IoT services are growing rapidly, connecting both consumer and enterprise IoT in the area of logistics, health, and other areas, as well as in helping reduce emissions and having a greener energy. In addition to that, maybe not explicitly mentioned here, but I'll pick up on it because it's been mentioned in the previous two presentations. In all our European markets today, we offer fixed wireless access services, which is wireless broadband services, giving us the ability to offer wireless broadband services where fixed services cannot be economically delivered. We also see a strong uptake because of the flexibility of that service in providing a flexible plug-and-play nomadic solution for second holiday homes, small offices, etc. In the context of, again, going back to traffic, it's interesting to see how, compare pre and post pandemic, how the traffic in our networks has evolved, and we see a stronger peak demand, typically over evening periods, particularly in the mobile network area, where we see increased over 75%. And it's interesting to note here that the profile of the demand between mobile and fixed is very similar, which means that when people are actually at home and in the vicinity of a Wi-Fi network, they still choose to use mobile data. And in fact, in some regions, we actually see Wi-Fi offload decreasing. So it's all about choice. It's all about being connecting customers in the best possible way wherever they are. Next slide, please, Jordan. So the key messages that I want you to take away today from an operator and an end customer perspective is that the digital economy, the future digital economy and digital society needs both good mobile broadband networks and good local license exempt Wi-Fi networks. And what we need in terms of 6 gigahertz is a fair and balanced approach, allowing the spectrum to be safeguarded for both those two network types. So today we looking at where we deploy 5G today and extrapolating our traffic forecasts, we think that we will begin to experience some capacity limitations in 5G networks within the next six years, and that's driven by the demands that I just mentioned there. So very important that we allocate the upper 6 gigahertz for IMT. We know it works. We know it works in macro cells for wide area coverage because we have massive MIMO technology, which is well established for 5G. And it's important to highlight, without that upper 6 gigahertz, we have no other spectrum opportunities in the foreseeable future. Millimeter wave is not the solution. That's for targeted deployments. And so without that upper 6 gigahertz, 5G networks will begin to deteriorate in terms of performance and capacity, with negative consequences on our digital society and economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I liked here particularly your focus on the user, both the consumer and the business user, and bringing Vodafone's unique perspective of being both a mobile and a fixed network operator. So you are ideally placed to talk about that balance of the use of the 6 gigahertz spectrum. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker from the Etisalat Group, Abdulhadi Abalmal, Director of Technology and Standardization. So please go ahead as talking as one of the countries where 5G is already well established.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much, everyone. I'm sorry, it looks like an interesting discussion today regarding the sort of potential of the mid-band for 5G. So before going forward, I would like to thank all the previous speakers. I think they made it easier for me to maybe address some of these important elements they have highlighted. And welcome to all colleagues, all participants to this workshop. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And to start with my presentation, if we can move to the next slide. My name is Abdulhadi Abalmal. I'm heading the Technology Standardization and Spectrum Management across Etisalat Group. Today, I would like to take you through some of the elements related to the mid-band potential looking also to the current discussion in the ITU for preparation of WRC 23. I think there are a number of elements we have to address during this discussion, including the 6 gigahertz and how the 6 gigahertz can contribute to the overall development of our IMT journey and our social and economic development of our countries. So let's move forward. Sorry, whomever, yeah. Yes, if you look today to the expectations we had through many forums in the ITU and you know, many of the forecasts provided by a number of industry players as well for the IMT traffic and subscription, we usually see them exceeded in reality. And interestingly, we can see in the recent Ericsson Mobility Report some sort of current fact as well as some forecast for the 5G subscription uptake forecasted over 8 years, let us say, of deployment, comparing the 4G and 5G, and it's very clear that the subtake, as you can see from the right-hand side figure, the 5G subscription uptake is expected to be faster and exceeding the 4G one. Indeed, when we talk about IMT, I think it's factual that IMT is definitely contributing significantly to our, overall countries, let us say, GDP growth, as well as our social and economic development. However, while we look to the mid-band in particular, we'll find some of the recent studies, like, for example, Corigo, for example, they have came up with a number of scenarios, and finally, the requirement estimates was from 1 gig to almost 3.7 gigahertz in the mid-band to address different type of requirement across different cities in our countries. Keep in mind that the previous, let us say, experience we had from the previous studies, this normally is being exceeded. Let me move to the next slide. Here, I'm trying just to give some sort of, highlight. And this is factual highlight indeed. If you look to the, let us say, the trend of the mobile technologies, interestingly, going from 2G to even 5G and maybe beyond even, the amount of spectrum, or let's say the amount of bandwidth we need per carrier has been growing significantly. And we have seen that going from 2G to maybe 3G, we go from 200 kilohertz per carrier, for example, going up all the way to 5 megahertz. And then we had this dual carrier type of implementation, or even multiple carrier type of implementation across 3G and 4G. And now even 5G in terms of carrier aggregation or dual carrier, or whatever we call it. And interestingly, we can see right now that we have, for example, millimeter wave, that IMT can support multiple hundreds of megahertz up to even 1 gigahertz. And this we speak almost about 5,000 times or even more of bandwidth requirement when we compare our journey from 2G even toward 5G evolution. However, when we talk about this sort of bandwidth, we have to keep in mind the balance between, as we normally say, the coverage between the capacity and the requirement. We have a number of use cases, and each use case has its own requirement and demand. So we have to be very careful when selecting those sort of resources in which band to accommodate both the coverage. Like, for example, in UHF, we have the agenda item 1.5 today, where we're looking for 600 megahertz and even below. And our definitely position that we see this as potential for flexibility for the future for many countries, even those who are currently using, for example, broadcasting, but going all the way to mid-band, which is now the topic of our discussion. And we have number of bands under consideration from 3 to 6 gigahertz within our agenda items for WRC, and definitely high band will be always also playing a role, but however, in a limited localized areas rather than in wider areas use cases. Going next. Next slide. Yes, thank you very much. So, when we talk about the use cases, there are a number of use cases. Just to build on what, Vodafone said, I mean, he's exactly correct. I mean, when we talk about the balance, some sort of requirement among different use cases and different, let us say, customers and society demand, we need to keep in mind here that it's a lot as one of also of the operator that had the implementation and the experience across fixed, mobile, satellite, across different type of areas as well. We have operation across most of the technologies that have been adopted worldwide. Even if we look to the current experience, we found clearly that the selection of the spectrum should be very little bit customized in the future. And if you look to this sort of use cases, going from a use case with ubiquitous coverage type of requirement to another use case with localized requirement, For example, within the scope of smart cities, for example, where we have multiple sectors and industries need to be addressed, it's interestingly to see that mid-band will play a very, very important role here in terms of balancing both, again, the coverage and capacity that we just referred to. You have some of the use cases, like, for example, transportation, where we think there are a number of use cases that will have high demand. But again, the continuous coverage is very essential in order to be able to address a number of transportation type of requirement. The message here to say, if you are looking to this sort of various type of sectors enhancement and development in your countries, you need to balance and you need to keep the mid-band in your eye and keep attention to it. Let me move next. Thank you very much. Yes, a number of messages here we're trying to deliver from Etisalat in this specific discussion. Again, I would like to build on some of the highlights mentioned by my other colleagues, by the other speakers. I think let me start with the comment from Luciana when she referred to 95 or 92, I think, % of people today worldwide is using mobile broadband and is like building their broadband service based on mobile IMT networks. Interestingly, if we keep this in mind and we look to the mid-band range from 1 to 7 gigahertz, we'll find that this sort of potential band, for example, let's say talk about 6 gigahertz, is a little bit important to be considered also for IMT for our current or even future development. Also looking to what Peter said, indeed, with regards to the operator experience in terms of licensed versus unlicensed, also Etisalat is building both type of networks and technologies on the ground. We really, when we talk about this sort of balance between those two requirements, based on the real needs of the market and societies and people, we come up with this sort of elements here, or conclusions, or even recommendations. Indeed, we have to balance between the licensed and unlicensed. Keep in mind that when we talk about 500 megahertz currently for Wi-Fi, we see that sufficient at this point of time. Going forward, we need to have a careful study of the utilization. Keep in mind, if you look to the right-hand side table here, when we look to the current situation in UAE, for example, regulation for the, let us say, license exempt, indeed, whether it is LTE unlicensed or NR unlicensed or even Wi-Fi, we'll have multiple number of bands being considered, some of them in the mid-band, some of them in the higher band. We speak for almost about maybe more than 1 gig in the mid-band and even more than that in the high band. And these are all available for these sort of license exempt. If we speak about localized, definitely the high band also can be playing very important role here, rather than going to a mid-band, which is a very precious resources for many use cases in the future in terms of public IMT networks. Again, we need to avoid action that are irreversible. So sometimes going from unlicensed to licensed almost can be impossible, but going from licensed to unlicensed at any point of time or license exempt might be a choice in the future for the administrations. However, flexibility is always a key for many market success, and that's why the 700 megahertz identification and allocation will be of interest, at least for keeping this flexibility for administration in the future. Technical contributions, let us say, for the and technical conditions, indeed, for the IMT implementation can be always addressed. Coexistence is always a choice, and building on what mentioned by Mr. Tariq regarding the standard and innovative, let me call it, approaches in addressing this sort of coexistence and sharing of different type of systems and services would be a really key message for our, let us say, balance of this sort of requirement. Finally, I'm saying here, one possible approach has been adopted by many countries worldwide, especially in Region 1 and even a number of ASMG countries, 500 megahertz for license exempt at the short term and mid-term, and maybe 700 megahertz to be, we propose this to be allocated and licensed even to IMT, and definitely the option for unlicensed or license exempt will be always there in the future. Just to conclude quickly, the agenda item will be addressed in WRC 23, covering number of mid-band. We definitely think that the support of this allocation and identification to IMT will provide the balanced approach and the flexibility for our national decision in the future. 6 gigahertz licensing, I think, will be a very good potential for many of the use cases, and the coexistence and addressing the elements and concerns from multiple other services existing will definitely be easier with the 5G and beyond capabilities today for addressing number of sharing concerns with the beamforming capability that limiting even the interference to the maximum possible, and also with the more intelligent type of systems that reduce interference to the other existing systems. Coexistence definitely is an option, and mid-band will definitely be potential for IMT in the future. With this, I would like to conclude, and sorry if I take longer time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I particularly liked your observation that there's a difference between the option value of going for licensed, and then if you don't require it, you still have the option to go unlicensed, but the other way around, you really forego that option. And I think this is a very, very useful insight, which regulators ought to bear and policymakers ought to bear in mind. With that, if we could bring everybody up again for the panel, that would be great. So we have Tarek, we've got Luciana, we are still waiting for Peter. Oh, here we all are. Wonderful. So I would like, of course, I'd like to again encourage the audience. Please do ask questions, which we then can pass to the panel. But perhaps I'll start off with a question relating to the amount of spectrum, mid-band spectrum that is required. So Luciana in her speech indicated that an average of 2 gigahertz of spectrum is needed in mid-bands to fulfill the IMT 2020 requirements. So where will the spectrum come from? I mean, you already spoke about it, but maybe we can be a little bit more specific about it. Where will that spectrum come from?
Thank you, Stefan. I don't see many options, really, as I said in my presentation. We have discussed lots of bands within the ITU context, within these discussions over the years. And if you look in the bands between 1 and 7 gigahertz, there are not many options. 3.3 to 4.2 is one of them. We see some countries considering more of the C-band releasing for IMT. We also find that other countries find it very hard. The 4.4 to 5 gigahertz has been a candidate band in the past, failed because there are existing services and it's a planned band, it's complicated. And then we have all of the 5 gigahertz is unlicensed, and it has radars and it has science services, and that has been discussed in the past as well. So we're left to 6 gigahertz. I personally don't see another option unless we can find new spectrum. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Any other panel member wants to weigh in?
Yeah, I would just like to add to that one of the other reasons why 6 gigahertz is suitable is that within for license use, the upper part is that if you take a typical market today and assume reasonable allocations within 3-4 operator market, then it gives each operator a spectrum block size which can minimize the cost per gigabyte. So you know, we in installing radio equipment, we reduce the cost per gigabyte of delivering the data, and that's obviously a benefit which can be translated into the benefit of the customers, and allows us to meet that acceleration of mobile traffic demand while keeping the cost structures at an appropriate level. That's really important for us. Having fragmented amounts of spectrum where we need to deploy more radio equipment is not a suitable cost structure for operators, bearing in mind all the other cost constraints that we have today, as well as pressures, other cost pressures on us. So that you know, the spectrum needs to be of a suitable size that the operators can cost effectively deliver a service and meet that traffic demand that I mentioned.
Yes, thank you very much.
If you allow me, Stephen, thank you very much. Sure. We are hearing this kind of thing that require 2 gigahertz or less or more for using the mobile. So maybe one of the questions that I can ask, you think you require this 2 gigahertz for what exactly? To reach what? The low latency or capacity, having capacity, or what exactly? This is also a question that we have to address. It 2 gigahertz required for what exactly? Because maybe we can use another technologies, or studies can be focusing on, for example, carrier aggregation. This is technology which allows operator to deploy 5G using multiple bands integrated together as a big block. The second technology, maybe we can use the dynamic spectrum sharing, this allowing 4G and 5G to exist simultaneously on the same band. So we need to understand first why we need this kind of 2 gigahertz, and maybe there are other ways. I'm not saying that we will not to see spectrum. We are studying to see the spectrum, more spectrum, and that's really good. But maybe if there is another way also, in order to see how we can use those existing spectrum and to give good services. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please go ahead, Abdul.
Yeah, maybe I can comment here. I think the question from Mr. Tariq is a very valid question, and we always need to keep in mind when we talk about the demand, it looks like we need to be more customized now, more specific even. Why do we need these bands and for what type of services? I think there are two elements here we have to look at. First of all, most of, as mentioned by Mr. Tariq and Mohammed, as you mentioned, when we talk about, for example, carrier aggregation, we need the carriers to be aggregated. And then the question is, if these carriers are available, for example, in terms of 20 megs or whatever, or 10 megs in terms of 4G today, and now we are moving with 5G with some hundreds of megs, and then we need to keep in mind that some of these sort of use cases need some sort of ubiquitous coverage, larger coverage, especially, for example, transportation, with number of use cases being addressed. And now mixing up the services itself, like going from transportation only to multiple type of services in many areas, which is coming from health, which is coming from factories, which is coming from some sort of wide and localized type of requirement, and most of these requirements will be addressed simultaneously within the same sort of network. These all of concepts that we makes it more clear why number of carriers need to be aggregated, and then we need these carriers to be aggregated. A second point is, when we talk about dynamic spectrum sharing, we need to keep always in mind the challenge we have today, which is almost losing almost 30% of our resources within the dynamic spectrum sharing. Yes, it is an option that we are considering today. However, there is a significant loss because of the technology limitation today in order to achieve to accommodate this sort of techniques. Going all the way to another point, which is very important as well, that how, while we're talking about different use cases, balancing the demand of uplink and downlink. I mean, normally we focus on downlink, but it's not anymore the case. I mean, many of the use cases we see today, cameras, surveillance, huge amount of demand for uplink is growing on daily basis. And if this is the case, we need to start thinking how we can dedicate some resources for the uplink. We used to have, for example, 80 or 70% of resources for downlink and the remaining for uplink. Keep in mind that the uplink is already limited by MIMO configuration, by power configuration, by many configurations. Keeping all of this in mind, balancing uplink and downlink, balancing resources of different use cases in the same time, in the same location. These are all ideas that we have to come together to build these carriers that we need to aggregate in order to achieve this requirement.
Luciana, please.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Just trying to go back to Tariq's question, because I think it's a really relevant question. And we asked ourselves those questions when we're doing this study early in the year. So the first question we asked is, what among all these requirements, among all these design and the specifications by the ITU of what IMT 2020 is supposed to be, what is most relevant to mid-band? How can we make sure that this is delivered, and what would be needed from the mid-band side? And the characteristics that we chose were the traffic density, but also the user one. So 100 megabits per second per user on the downlink and 50 megabits per second per user on the uplink. Latency is not considered because, of course, that would be more on the millimeter wave side. That would be most relevant to deliver the latency that is required. And we understand there is a combination of low band, mid band, and high band. With respect to the carrier aggregation, one thing that we did in this study, and actually it comes as a quite conservative number, we consider that all existing IMT bands evolved 5G. We're not talking about 4G plus 5G. We're saying that there's going to be a point in time when all the networks will evolve from 3G to 4G to 5G. And so that's actually quite a conservative assumption. And even using all that, and we're aggregating all the carriers, we're not just talking about new bands, we're talking about all the existing bands, all the bands identified to IMT in the radio regulations, we still need more because the average is 2 gigahertz. So with that, we believe that is actually quite a sound requirement from the industry, because we would need that spectrum to deliver what was designed in the recommendation by the ITU. Thank you.
Great.
If you allow me, Steve,
Yes.
one more comment, please.
Tarek,
Sorry.
yes, please do.
Yes.
Please do. This is an interesting
Yeah.
debate.
So because it is important. I really appreciate the comments made by Abdelhadi and Louisiana about these things. Why I raised this question? I believe you all see it. You all saw it at previous WRC and reports which are coming from other community, for example, broadcasting, satellite, that you are having a lot of spectrum and you are not using it. So we need to also to be ready how to, GSMA or the mobile industry has to prepare why we need it. Because if you will not convince those others, then it will be not easy to get those spectrum. So in summary, we have to justify. You have to justify why you need this 2 gigahertz with all the spectrum that you are having. They will say that you are having in UHF and 1.8, 2.6, and 3.6. So all those, why we need more? We need just to justify it from your side, so that we when we discuss it also as a regulator with all industry, we know how to respond it. It's not something easy, but thank you very much again.
But maybe just to very, very quickly add to such an interesting discussion, but if I may, Stefan,
Please do.
But if you look at where 5G networks in the world today have, or where 5G has taken off in particular in the world today, it's in regions where there has been mass deployment of 5G with dedicated spectrum. And you know, at Vodafone, we have this 5G built right strategy, which is to say, if we're going to deploy 5G, we will do it with dedicated spectrum at 3.5 gigahertz with 100 megahertz or so channel sizes that will give us a step change in performance from 4G that our customers demand and our customers need. Okay, so if you extrapolate that into what we will need in the future, that's exactly why in the context of 6 gigahertz we need that spectrum to be able to evolve that 5G network. DSS is a very useful tool, but it needs to be used extremely carefully, because as we mentioned earlier on, basically with DSS you're adding 2 systems onto 1 frequency band. You're increasing the overhead, and therefore could actually reduce the speed available to a user. So it's a useful tool when in particular circumstances, but it's not the solution to capacity.
Yes, great. Yeah, I think that sums it up quite well. And in fact, Tarek, you're quite right. The industry needs to answer that question. Why do you need the spectrum? And I think the answer is to a large extent contained in this report Luciana mentioned. And I invite you all to visit the GSMA website and download that mid-bands requirements in the 2025 to 2030 timeframe. That report really explains why this is needed. So with that, I can actually move on to a question from the audience. We have one question here. Have any countries in the ASMG region made provisional decisions on the 6 gigahertz band? And also, what about the rest of region 1? So who would like to take that question?
I think this is regarding to ASMG. If you allow me, Stephen.
Yes, please.
As I mentioned, there are some countries already take a decision. For example, Saudi Arabia already they have taken a decision about the 6 gigahertz to full 1200 megahertz assigned for Wi-Fi for unlicensed or license exempt. UAE already assigned 500 megahertz for Wi-Fi, and the remaining still we are looking to the studies going on in the ITU 1.2. Some countries still they are doing consultation like Tunisia, maybe Qatar also. The rest, they are all still studying and looking to the result, what will be happen in 1.2 of WRC 23. So this is a summary. I think Morocco also, they have already assigned 500 megahertz for Wi-Fi. So this is just summary about the whole 6 gigahertz in the Arab region.
And maybe Peter, Luciana, for region 1, any insights, Africa and Europe, the south and the north? Oh, you're on mute, Luciana.
Sorry. For Europe, there was a decision a while ago for the lower 500 megahertz. For the upper 700 megahertz, there has been no decision. There's a study item ongoing, but it's also part of the agenda item, and they have been very active in those discussions. For Africa, there is a recommendation from ACHU approved, I think, July, about the lower 500 megahertz, but the upper 700 megahertz subject to WRC discussions, and they have been quite supportive of that. For RCC, are very supportive of the upper 6 gigahertz for IMT, and we have seen quite a lot of movement from them on the matter. So that's where we are in region 1. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. And I think with that, perhaps one could also say, rush this decision and then regret at leisure is the sort of thing you might get yourselves into. I think perhaps waiting for WRC 23 and making the right decisions is what it seems most countries in the region 1 are looking to. So
I completely agree with that, Stefan. In fact, you took the words straight out of my mouth. I urge, regulators in the region not to rush to a decision before WRC 23. Let the appropriate studies take place. Listen to what people are saying, and not rush into a regrettable decision.
So with that, I have another question from the audience. This is quite specific. What's the future of band N46? That's 5150 to 5925 megahertz, N47, 588, 5855 to 5925 in the ASMG region. Yes, please, Abdul Hadi.
Thank you very much. Maybe not about the ASMG itself, but in principle, first of all, about the technology. As you're aware, when we talk about license exempt, there are different flavors for the license exempt. Since many years now, we got this sort of LTE or 3GBB unlicensed version, which is called, for example, the multifier, some of the commercial solutions in the market today, or LTE unlicensed. Now there's some sort of other development as well in the NR unlicensed, where there are some good coexistence between both 3GBB and IEEE technologies here. So I think unlicensed concept or license exempt concept have different flavors and different technologies that will be up to the choice of the market at a certain point of time. Keeping in mind, this definitely Wi-Fi, especially in the 5 gig, was a bit older or a bit old. But I mean, again, there's some sort of good movement with definitely the different in performance between the 3GBB solution and the maybe IEEE solution. In multiple actually enterprise type of to address multiple enterprise type of requirement using the same license exempt solutions, but then on 3GBB version rather than IEEE version. So I think regardless of what different markets is being adopting, I think it's maybe in most of the time license exempt are technology neutral if they are maintaining certain type of conditions like listen before talk, some of the technical aspects that they have to respect as a technology let us say feature. I think then all the options are available for every user for the license exempt, whether they go for the let us say IEEE version or even the other version. I think even this is good to keep in mind while we are considering any license exempt. It's not only Wi-Fi, it can be Wi-Fi, it can be licensed, unlicensed LTE, or even 5G unlicensed. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for that. Any other comments from the panel? Yes, Luciana.
Thank you, Stefan. Yes, I think it's really important to note that those bands are unlicensed bands. And as any unlicensed bands, they have some quite restrictive operation conditions, and they have, for example, the 5470 to 5925 have quite a lot of operation conditions that they should not cause interference in some of the services that operate, and they should change channels. And with all the unlicensed, there is no handover, and the quality of service is different. And when you go outside, it's not the same. There's no continuation of service, and all that is really interesting. I think it's one component of the service, is one component of 5G, but it's solely responsible for delivery of 5G services, and that will be quite difficult for the operators to provide any service as we know it with only that type of band. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other comment on that? If not, I think there's a good connection between that and another question here. Do we in fact need more spectrum for countries that performance targets in excess of those that are currently in the IMT 2020 requirements? So in excess of the 100 megabits downlink and 50 megabits uplink. I think that is, for example, the case in Saudi. Perhaps somebody can talk about that, whether we need additional spectrum for that, and where can that be found, or what would be the solution if the spectrum can't be found. Okay, ladies first. Luciana, perhaps.
Thank you. I think there's lots of elements. As I said in my presentation, where is this spectrum, mid-band spectrum, going to come from? And every country and every region should be asking themselves that question and providing answers. If Saudi has decided to give the entire 1200 megahertz to IMT, of course, we understand, we respect their decision. It creates, to unlicense, it creates pressure on the IMT spectrum side. And maybe their solution goes on the C-band part of the spectrum and release up to 4.2 gigahertz, which they have already announced and talked about. So there's a number of options on the table for spectrum, but that's not really a solution that is easy for lots of countries. So we really need to review that. Similar, for example, with the United States, you really need to review on a case by case, but also that affects harmonization, which is a huge issue. That's why we think we need to wait until WRC 23 and look at our options and look what's on the table to make those decisions in a calmly manner. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think, sorry, Peter, maybe go first, and then we go back to Abdelhadi.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Yeah, they'll completely agree with that. Avoid fragmentation and drive for harmonization. Those types of speeds delivered at capacity need a good cost structure for operators to deliver it, and that's delivered by harmonization and avoiding fragmentation, as I described earlier.
Abdelhadi?
Yeah, thank you very much, and fully agree with my colleagues actually on the previous comments. Indeed, my comment is a bit different here. Yes, there might be some decisions taken, but probably it's good some time to rethink how we implement these decisions. So maybe it's not to cancel the decision, but again, as I said, how to implement it. If we start with any technology, we start on a step-by-step basis, and as we going forward, we are evaluating the needs and we grow as we go. But we do not put all the resources in one box, and then if the box did not work or for something wrong happening for that box, we lose everything. We have to be very careful on how we implement this. We're just starting with whatever version is from, for example, Wi-Fi or any other unlicensed or licensed exempt. Let us have the try. Let us start with implementing something maybe localized, that, for example, maybe X, and then while we go, we think about the best condition for my market. In this case, whether I'm using, for example, certain technology in certain condition, like, for example, indoor versus outdoor, maybe, for example, in localized.
Oh, you've got on mute, sorry.
I'm sorry, maybe I was clarifying, my apologies for that. Maybe I was clarifying that there are different type of options when we're doing the licensing aspects, whether from indoor to outdoor, localized versus public, area bases, and so on and so forth. and whatever condition we need to accommodate. But actually, as I said, let us grow as we go. Let us start with implementing now decisions and maybe a rational way, looking to the future as well as the current, and then seeing the current demand, put something for the current, and then evaluate while we grow, and then put the resources on the right box at certain point of time. This is my suggestion. And actually, yes, if there would be a lack of spectrum at certain point of time with the growing use cases, because we have to keep in mind it's not anymore we speak about, for example, a human communication on mobile phone, which is video and voice, is not anymore the case. We have to think now it's not yet there. However, the movement across worldwide now, the whole world is moving with not even machine concept, but even sensor concept. So it's connecting everything, every sensor, every machine, and every human. With the 6G is even coming in the near future, we think that things are going with more complicated aspects. We think quantum computing will play a very important role in the coming 5G evolutions and 6G. And quantum computing concept means I'm having much more capability to store, to compute at certain point of time without reliable and really enough resources for this sort of connectivity to transfer these sort of resources on a proper time for certain action, whatever is the field, whether it's health, for remote surgery, or whether it's transport for managing some sort of mapping and many data while on mobility or move. Again and again, we are saying we have to keep in mind that some sort of early decisions, which is not really fully utilized and not really fully, let us say, addressing the current need, might block many other needs in the future that will be not in favor of many administration. Thank you very much.
I think this underlines again the don't take hasty decision conclusion we had. Tarek, maybe any comments from a regulator side where if there is a high performance target, what the solution might be?
Well, I was trying to listen here. In order to need to reach to this higher requirement, 100 megabits or for uplink, downlink, and other. Yeah, we are looking, this is maybe from our side, in which use cases that we need to achieve this higher requirement performance. For all use cases, so I believe there will be for certain use cases that we need to achieve this higher requirement. For those certain cases, which frequency band we need to see it? Do we need to see it in the mid-band, or can we use it in the millimeter wave? Why we not use millimeter wave for such uses? So maybe from our side as a regulator, we need to see it maybe by use case, which vertical that require this higher performance requirement, and then which frequency band that can be suit or can fulfill this requirement for that use cases. So that is our concern, our study that we have to focus on it, and this is what we are trying to do with in UAE. In UAE, that we would like to develop a use cases working group, and then they have to study the requirement to see where they want to reach, which requirement, which performance, and then which frequency band it can be suit for them. That is our comments from our as a regulator.
Maybe quick comment, Stephen, if you allow me. Just very quick comment on
yes.
one very important point raised by Mr. Tariq. I think with regards to the use cases, I think fully agree. It's not every size fitting all. And just to address even the issue of the millimeter wave, which is high band with definitely limited type of coverage capabilities, and then always it's more into hotspot localized type of environment rather than sometimes the continuity type of environment. And when we talk about the use cases, we think about two aspects here. Some of them is very localized, and then definitely millimeter wave will play a very important role, and then non-localized, which is public or continuous or ubiquitous coverage is required. And then we need to look at then on some other bands. Definitely millimeter wave will play this sort of middle ground, let us say a balanced, role here between a capacity requirement in terms of high bandwidth and the coverage requirement that's not really in 20 plus gigahertz propagation characteristics. It's some sort of 5 to 7, 3 to 7, let us call type of characteristics, but at the same time with enough bandwidth rather than very good coverage resources like in UHF, but again very limited bandwidth is there. So I think every one of them will play its own role. Use cases, as I said, moving from localized but going also to transportation, for example, which is a very promising one. Drones, whether it's transportation on the ground or even in the air, and many other use cases that, surveillance, for example, on nationwide basis. Some of them are localized, some of them are public-wise, some of them are on mobility, some of them are fixed. And while I'm saying this, we need to keep in mind now the agenda item 9.1.c, where we think it's getting more, I think, in our point of view, important, especially after the COVID-19, post-COVID-19, where we have seen that there is a real lack of fixed, even broadband, solutions in our markets. And that's why we need to think about those fixed service resources and spectrum resources that we can utilize over standardized the global ecosystem, like, for example, IMT ecosystem, to serve our fixed broadband and mobile broadband as well. We have to balance between those resources for mobile with different use cases required, and also these resources that are available today for fixed, but unfortunately are not, in our point of view, well utilized because of the lack of global standard. We believe that, IMT with, its long profile and even future-proof will help to address many of the even fixed broadband under 9.1.c and many of these spectrum. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this comments. I'm afraid we are running out of time. We're bringing this to an end. So just to wrap up here, I think one of the key things is to understand that we have this requirements that the people or consumers and businesses will enjoy a 10 to 100-fold increase in performance, but they're not, of course, prepared to pay anymore for that. And to make these economics work, it is absolutely essential to have the additional spectrum available. I think that's the conclusion here, because as we know, it's not really about the coverage gap, it's about the affordability gap. And this is where spectrum has a key role to play. So thank you to all our panel members. Some great comments here. We now have a short break, and then we'll be back in 15 minutes, I believe. So, and I release you now back to your lunch or coffee breaks, whatever it is. Thank you to all of you on the panel.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.